Did you know that Japan is the only country in the world whose constitution explicitly renounces war? Japan's military today is almost unrecognizable compared to the modest, defense-only force it once had. However, this transformation isn't surprising to anyone who's been paying attention to Japan's history. The world might see Japan as the poster child of pacifism, but the reality is far more complicated. For decades, Japan has walked a fine line, balancing peaceful ideals with the harsh realities of living in a dangerous neighborhood. But now that balance is tipping and Japan is rethinking what pacifism really means in a world that's growing increasingly unstable. Japan is entering a new chapter, one that could very well end the pacifist nation we thought we knew, and one that may soon see Japan return to the very war stance it swore off decades ago. Explaining why Japan swore off war in the first place seems like a pretty good place to start. After all, Japan's deep-rooted pacifism is a far cry from the militaristic powerhouse the nation was just a few generations ago. An empire driven by ambition, imperialism, and a brutal military machine. This machine was made possible by the sweeping industrialization of the late 19th and early 20th century. The rapid rise of factories, railroads, and military infrastructure, coupled with a swelling sense of nationalism, ballooned Japan's ambitions. The country felt threatened by the dominance of Western powers, so it sought to carve out its own empire, especially in Asia. The Japanese military's increasing role was directly tied to the nation's imperial dreams. This was a country that was prepared to fight, conquer, and expand at all costs. A country willing to drench its hands in blood on an industrial scale. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, deepening its aggressive expansion in the Asia-Pacific region, which began with the annexation of Taiwan in 1895 and Korea in 1910. By 1941, Japan had escalated this ambition to new extremes, culminating in the attack on Pearl Harbor. This action single-handedly thrust the world into the Pacific theater of World War II. Over the course of the war, Japan's military engaged in atrocities, including the horrific Nanjing Massacre, which claimed an estimated 300,000 Chinese lives. The country was becoming a force to be reckoned with, but also a pariah in the eyes of the rest of the world. This aggression came at an unimaginable cost. According to some estimates, over 3 million Japanese soldiers and civilians died in the conflict. Another 200,000 lives were wiped out in the flash of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The shock of these bombs marked the devastating climax of a war that had already changed the world in unspeakable ways. A nation that had once stormed the Pacific with its imperial ambitions was now on its knees, with its emperor forced to address the nation over the radio to announce Japan's surrender. The Japanese people, who had never before heard the voice of their emperor, were struck by the finality of it all. They realized that the militarization of Japan had been a mistake, and with that realization came a deep-seated hatred of anything military. After Japan's defeat, General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers, spearheaded the country's demilitarization. His goal was to create a better world out of the blood and carnage of the past. And that world, he believed, was one where Japan would never again wield military power. The centerpiece of this transformation was Article 9 of Japan's new constitution adopted in 1947. This article renounced war and forbade Japan from maintaining military forces. Article 9 declared, aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat of use of force as means of settling international disputes. The article goes on to add, in order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. As we now know, forever and never are tricky words. Turns out this was more of a for now kind of deal. Less than 5 years after the ink dried on Japan's pacifist constitution, the world was already pushing the country in a very different direction. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, the Cold War was in full swing, and the United States needed help. Japan was conveniently located as a bulwark against the communist threat, and suddenly, Article 9 became more of a suggestion than a strict rule. Even after Japan regained its independence in 1952, the country remained tightly aligned with the United States through the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. The U.S. maintained a large presence on Japanese soil, with over 130 military bases, and Japan effectively became an airstrip and staging ground for American operations during the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and later conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan. Japan, despite its constitution's pacifist rhetoric, had become a key player in America's military strategy in Asia. The presence of these U.S. bases and the arrangement that allowed Japan to host the largest American contingent abroad fueled a certain dependency on American military might. Japan, in a way, served as a floating aircraft carrier for the U.S., enabling intervention across the region at a moment's notice. Despite the formation of the SDF, Japan remained far from a full military power. The SDF was designed to defend the country, not wage war, as Japan continued to cling to its anti-war ideals. However, the wheels of militarization were in motion, and the pacifist constitution was starting to show more and more cracks. These cracks were particularly visible after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed. The US-Japan military alliance, which had been largely justified by the need to counter communism, was now left without a clear purpose. Japan entered a period of economic stagnation and identity crisis. The booming economy of the 1980s collapsed, leaving many to question the nation's place on the world stage. At the same time, nationalist sentiment grew, and some leaders began to feel that Japan had apologized enough for its wartime actions and that it was time to shed its post-war identity. This shift was reflected in the 1991 Gulf War, where Japan's refusal to send troops due to its pacifist constitution became a point of humiliation. Only a year later, the Japanese parliament authorized the country's participation in the United Nations peacekeeping operations. It started with Cambodia, where Japan sent 600 troops in an engineering unit, 75 civilian police officers, 8 unarmed military observers, and 41 civilian election observers. Next, Japan sent units to Mozambique to primarily coordinate the transport of personnel and cargo at harbors and airports. In total, the country dispatched 3 control units of 48 personnel each. East Timor was another destination where Japan sent personnel in the early days, with over 2,000 engineering unit troops, 17 staff officers, and 3 civilian police officers in the contingent. Now, these missions might have had the word peace in their name, but many Japanese people still saw them as an erosion of the nation's Pacific stance. These reactions didn't seem to sway the Japanese government, as the country had quietly ramped up its military capabilities under the guise of defense by the late 2000s. The creation of anti-submarine helicopter carriers, essentially aircraft carriers with slight modifications, highlighted this growing militarization. So did the development of plans to fortify the Nansei Islands, where China was disputing a part of the territory. These plans indicated Japan's readiness to assert its security interests in the region. A key moment came in 2014 when Abe approved a reinterpretation of Article 9. This move allowed Japan to exercise collective self-defense, essentially giving the country the right to fight alongside allies, including the US, if attacked. Despite the resistance, Japan's militarization continued to grow. By 2015, Japan's national legislature passed laws that allowed the SDF to support allied nations in combat. This marked a significant step away from the pacifism of the 1947 Constitution, further confirming that the country's military identity was being reshaped, even if unofficially. They pushed to revise Article 9 entirely by 2020, showed that Japan's transformation from a pacifist to a more militarized state was well underway. The constitutional reinterpretation set the stage for an ongoing debate about Japan's military future, revealing that the cracks in Article 9 were not just superficial. And then, 2022 came and obliterated any lingering illusions about Japan's pacifism. The Russian invasion of Ukraine jolted the global order, forcing Japan to accelerate its trajectory toward full-scale militarization. Why did a conflict some 5,000 miles away, in a region with no direct connection to Japan, trigger such a profound response? The answer lies in the unsettling parallels and implications the invasion posed for Japan's own security. It was a wake-up call that revealed just how vulnerable nations could be in the face of aggressive neighbors. And remember, Japan has as many as 3 such neighbors, and all 3 of them are nuclear-armed dictatorships: China, North Korea, and Russia itself. Hitoshi Nakama, a Japanese nationalist politician and fisherman, summarizes this perfectly. Peace relies on a balance of power. Russia attacked Ukraine. It's a mistake to think that we won't be attacked because we don't have any army or military bases. That era is over. This sobering realization resonated with many in Japan, where public sentiment shifted significantly. For the first time since World War II, a majority of Japanese citizens expressed support for strengthening the country's military defenses. The invasion also exposed just how unprepared Japan was for sustained conflict. Retired Air Self-Defense Force General Toshimichi Nagaiwa pointed out that Japan was like 200 meters behind in a 400-meter sprint when it came to modernizing its military capabilities. Years of underinvestment and the long-standing 1% GDP cap on defense spending left Japan with inadequate munitions, spare parts, and other critical resources. The contrast with China, whose defense spending surpassed Japan's decades ago, underscored the urgent need for reform. Japan and China share a history fraught with conflict and mistrust, rooted in both ancient and modern grievances, which continue to shape their volatile relationship. The Second Sino-Japanese War, which from 1937 to 1945 was marked by immense suffering, including the horrifying Nanjing Massacre. This period of brutality has left lasting scars, with ongoing debates about Japan's acknowledgement of its wartime atrocities fueling tensions. After World War II, Japan's post-war economic rise contrasted sharply with China's struggles during its communist transformation, establishing Japan as the dominant power in Asia for much of the 20th century. The territorial dispute over the Senkaku Islands, known as the Diaoyu Islands in China, lies at the heart of contemporary tensions. These uninhabited islands, administered by Japan but claimed by China, have become a flashpoint for conflict. Chinese Coast Guard ships have routinely entered Japanese waters for years, testing the country's capacity to defend its sovereignty and pushing the region closer to confrontation. Adding to the tension is China's rapid military expansion, which has drastically outpaced Japan's capabilities. Between 2016 and 2020, China's navy launched as many ships as Japan's entire fleet, and in 2022, Beijing's military drills included firing 5 missiles into Japan's exclusive economic zone. Of course, there's also the Taiwan issue. Japan's geographic proximity and strategic importance tie the country's fate to the outcome of any potential conflict. The Japanese island of Yonaguni lies a mere 60 miles away from Taiwan, ensuring Japan's involvement in any cross-strait confrontation, especially given its role as a key hub for U.S. military operations in the region. Recent years have seen Japan describe China as an unprecedented strategic challenge, which is also unprecedented for this formerly pacifist nation. Japan aligned itself more closely with U.S. allies in the region, including South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia. This newfound allyship between Japan and South Korea is a huge deal, given the two countries' less than friendly history. South Korea was once a Japanese colony, and the scars of that era run deep. With East Asia becoming the new stage for a Cold War, neither of the two countries were forced to leave their differences behind. As you can imagine, this newfound alliance was met with nothing but hostility from North Korea. North Korea has posed a growing threat to Japan for decades, particularly since the 1990s, when it began its nuclear weapons program. For Japan, this marked a shift in its security concerns, as it was now facing a nuclear-armed neighbor. The country's missile tests have repeatedly rattled Japan, with some missiles even flying over Japanese territory. One of the most notable incidents occurred in 2017 when North Korea launched a missile that flew over Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island, prompting emergency alerts and public fear. It demonstrated a chilling truth: Japan was within North Korea's striking range. In addition to missile tests, North Korea has conducted 6 nuclear tests since 2006, each escalating tensions in the region. Given Japan's history with nuclear weapons, these developments have struck a particularly nerve-wracking chord. As the only nation to have ever experienced the devastating effects of nuclear weapons firsthand, Japan has long positioned itself as a global leader in the fight against nuclear proliferation. However, the reality of North Korea's expanding nuclear arsenal has left Japan grappling with a tough dilemma. After all, North Korea's nuclear and missile tests have put Japan in an increasingly precarious position. The threat is no longer just a distant possibility, it's now a growing reality, one that Japan simply can't ignore as it seeks to protect its citizens and its sovereignty. So, what exactly is Japan doing to protect its citizens and its sovereignty from North Korea and all the growing regional and global threats? Well, first, the country dramatically changed its national defense strategy. Former Prime Minister Fumio Kishida unveiled this change in December 2022, publicly acknowledging that Japan's traditional pacifist defense posture was no longer sufficient in the face of rising threats. Kishida said, "Our defense is insufficient. In order to drastically strengthen it, we're increasing the defense budget to 43 trillion yen over the next 5 years. The government plans to increase military spending by 60% by 2027, which would bring it to that 43 trillion yen we mentioned, which was about $320 billion US in 2022, placed Japan on track to become the world's 3rd largest military spender, only behind the US and China." Kishida's government has also committed to spending up to 2% of Japan's GDP on defense, aligning with NATO standards. In late 2024, Japan approved a record-breaking $55.13 billion defense budget for 2025, marking the 13th consecutive year of increased defense spending. But what will Japan do with all that money? The goal is to boost defense capabilities, including acquiring advanced weapon systems and fortifying military infrastructure. The weapon part is especially indicative of Japan's growing militarization. As Article 9 is currently interpreted, Japan can't possess offensive military weapons. This means that Japan can't own intercontinental ballistic missiles, any weapons of mass destruction, aircraft carriers, or bomber fleets. However, this interpretation hasn't stopped Japan from deploying submarines, destroyers, helicopter carriers, and fighter aircraft. And all of these systems have substantial combat potential. One of the most significant acquisitions in this regard is 400 US-made Tomahawk cruise missiles, which are capable of striking targets beyond Japan's borders. Japan is also looking to develop indigenous long-range missile capabilities, though the timeline for their deployment is expected to extend into the 2030s. In addition to these offensive systems, Japan has expanded its defense with advanced missile defense technologies, including anti-missile systems deployed across the Okinawa Islands. The Okinawa Islands are also home to Japan's expanding military presence. The latest addition is a new base on Ishigaki Island, strategically located near Taiwan and China. Reports from 2024 put this figure to 570 troops and about 260 of their family members. Given that the entire Okinawa houses 55,000 U.S. military personnel and 75% of all U.S. military bases in Japan, this number might seem insignificant to you. However, this number is a massive deal for Japan, especially considering the challenges it faces in building its military personnel. Japan's recruitment has been running about 20% below its targets for years, with concerns over a shrinking population and a growing reluctance to join the military exacerbating the issue. To address these challenges, Japan is focusing on improving recruitment strategies and enhancing the appeal of military service. Japan has made great efforts to present its SDF as a capable and effective force, not just for disaster response, but for national defense. As part of these efforts, the SDF has been participating in an increasing number of military exercises. In 2024 alone, Japan took part in major military exercises, RIMPAC, led by the US and involving 29 countries, Keen Sword, a US-Japan bilateral exercise, Malabar, a naval exercise hosted by India, and Pacific Vanguard, a joint naval exercise with the US and other allies. These exercises are designed to strengthen the defense alliance and ensure Japan is prepared to respond to threats in the region, particularly from China and North Korea. But even with all these advancements, some experts believe that Japan is too late. It's simple. The pacifism of the overwhelming majority of the Japanese population has slowed the country's militarization, and now it's too late to catch up.